Good morning, everyone. It is 9:30, so we're going to get started on our webinar. My name is Amy Pariseau. I'm your host today for the NHLRA Workforce Series. Our topic today is the New Hampshire Department of Labor Overview. We are recording this session, so you can review it at a future date. And I will also be monitoring the chat if anyone has any questions that come up during this presentation. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Rudy Ogden. He is the Deputy Commissioner of the New Hampshire Department of Labor, and he will be presenting today on the New Hampshire Department of Labor overview. So over to you, Rudy.
Thank you, Amy. And I do want to thank Amy and Mike for inviting me. The department always looks forward to working with employers in these type of contexts, as opposed or outside of inspections. It's always good to see people who are taking on, the tact of being proactive and seeking out answers and asking questions in advance of any issues. So I am going to share my screen. Can you all see that?
Yes, I can see that.
So just in terms of kind of an overview of what we're going to touch upon, first, I'm going to talk about, some ways in which you might interact with the department. I am going to talk about what happens during an inspection. I don't know, in terms of the audience today, who's been inspected before, but if you've not been inspected before, or even if you have been inspected before, kind of the point of that topic is just to kind of talk about what an inspection should be or how it should be happening. I think the meat of what we're going to talk about today is going to be a discussion of issues that often come up. Mike specifically wanted me to talk in some depth about tips or issues surrounding tips, also about youth labor requirements are something that always comes up when we talk about hospitality. I would note that when I'm discussing the issues that come up, I'm highlighting or have highlighted those issues that principally come up in the context of our inspections within the hospitality industry. So there's certainly some other things that we see employers dealing or grappling with, but I'm trying to focus most wholly on those items that come up mostly in the context of our inspections of hospitality. While I'm talking about those issues, I'll be referencing some things, I would call them kind of self-checks. These are things that if I was an employer or if I was an attorney, I am an attorney, but if I was an attorney offering compliance guidance or assistance to an employer, these are some things that I would offer them just as kind of, some of them are very obvious, but I think that there are things that, an employer should ask themselves or be asking of their staff or be asking of their programs and processes relative to their operation of their organization, just in terms of kind of checking or gauging where they're at. We'll also talk about what happens after an inspection. So some ways to, kind of come, if you have been inspected by us, what happens after an inspection or what are the steps to take. And then we obviously will have time for questions. If people have questions throughout, feel free to stop me. And as I always say, every time I do these presentations, if I don't have the answer to something, which does sometimes happen, I'll be sure to take the question back to the department, then I'll make sure that the actual experts are able to give us an answer. So in terms of starting off, just very briefly, when I talk about interactions with the department or how you might come into contact with the department, I'd first start by highlighting, training and questions. Obviously, training is an environment such as this. I do know every year, or you might know every year, that in the spring, our inspection division, our administrator, Michelle Small, she actually goes out. With COVID, it wasn't out in person, it was more remote settings. But typically, absent COVID or things like that, the department every year goes out and does trainings for upwards of 200 employers at given sites. Additionally, the department is willing to do one-on-one trainings or trainings for particular subsections of employers. So that's something where if you're interested in training, there's several ways in which you can get training by the department. I always highlight when we talk about training that we don't want to come across as patronizing. That's something I never want to do. I understand that, as working at an agency, I don't run a business and I don't pretend that I know all of the particulars of how to run a business or all the practical implications that you folks go through every day. So that's when we talk about training, it's not necessarily just sitting there saying, well, do this, it's easy. It's more our trainings are geared at, again, dealing with compliance questions and issues. And I will say sometimes we acknowledge that, yes, there are hurdles, there are hardships to complying with some of these things. but the law is what it is. So I just highlight that. In terms of questions, the only thing I want to point out there, and I would think Mike would echo my comments on this, the department is always happy to take questions. Mike reaches out to me quite frequently and he'll just ask, hey, Rudy, what about this? What about that? And we really like Mike, but I would say anybody could do that. We're okay with anybody reaching out to us and asking those questions. And I also highlight when we talk about folks asking us questions, it's certainly not the type of thing where if a question comes in, we're not then saying, oh, it sounds like they have problems, let's go do an inspection tomorrow. Truly, we're happy to take those questions. If it sounds like something's problematic, we'll steer them in the right direction. But it's not something where we're then going to look out and levy penalties. And again, I would hope that folks feel comfortable calling us. And again, as members of this organization, you have a great resource in the sense that Mike contacts us all the time, and we try and be very responsive in answering his questions. Workers' compensation, I'll just touch on very briefly. The department, one of our principal obligations is administering workers' compensation in the state. And I just highlight that because there are times in which we will reach out to the hospitality industry or the employers, and we're more dealing with, hey, did you report a notice of injury? Or, hey, we don't have proof of coverage or something of that nature. So I just highlight that because sometimes you will or could get correspondence from us focused on those issues related to our administration of workers' comp. We also process wage claims. So I think most frequently folks deal with us and they consider us in the context of inspections, but we also process wage claims. I'll talk in a further slide a little bit more about wage claims, but I just highlight that there is a distinction between wage claims and inspections. And then again, lastly, inspections, that's when we go out and we're actually inspecting an employer relative to either purported or possible compliance issues. In terms of inspections and wage claims, I just want to highlight there is a distinction between the two. A wage claim is when an employee or former employee files with the department a claim saying, based upon my employment with employer X, I feel as though I'm owed money. That is an action that the employee or the former employee is taking on their own motion. The department would provide a forum for that hearing. Namely, we would allow that complaint to process and there could ultimately be an adjudicative hearing. But I point out that that's not the department taking action or the department asserting that wages are owed. So there is clearly a distinction between wage claims and inspections. Inspections are when we take a complaint or complaints and that spurs us to say, okay, we're actually going to go and look at that organization or employer and see if they have compliance problems. One thing when I talk about inspections, I would highlight is the fact that we are primarily complaint driven. I would say the vast majority, 99% of our inspections are complaint driven. What I mean by that is we are not typically driving, down the road and saying, okay, there's a restaurant, let's stop in and see if everything's okay. We are primarily, and again, 99% of the time, what we are doing is responding to someone or people, a collection of people calling us and saying, hey, I work here and this is happening or not happening. We try and filter through those complaints. We try and say, is it an actual actionable complaint or is it just someone looking to cause problems? And when we think that there's something to look at, we will go in and look at it. One thing I would highlight that you may notice as a difference, I think in the past, a lot of times our inspections were much more exhaustive in the sense that when we went in and did an inspection, we tended to say, give us everything. We're going to look at everything. I think there were reasons for that, some of them good, but I would note that over the last year to year and a half, we have more tailored our approach to truly when we go into a business now, our inspectors are oftentimes asking for one or two things. And when I say one or two things, maybe they're asking for more than one or two things, but their focus is on one or two topics. And really what we've tried to do with our folks for, again, various reasons, is we've tried to say, okay, if we had a complaint and they're talking about these three things, let's just look at that. That's, again, something we've tried to move towards. It's something that we think there's benefit to. And again, it's something that in your experience, to the extent you are inspected, you might notice that more tailored approach. In terms of my comment about being primarily or overwhelmingly complaint driven, there are a couple of instances in which we would look at something outside of a complaint coming from an employee. And those would be what we call special inspections or record referrals. A special inspection is if, something atypical, say another state agency says, hey, we're dealing with this employer and we saw this or didn't see that, you might be interested. That's something where we would go in and look at it, even though there wasn't necessarily a complaint. And then record referrals, I will be honest, those most often come up in the context of workers' comp. What I mean by a record referral is the department does get certain data feeds, like we'll get record or a notification of any time an employer drops or secures coverage. And sometimes depending upon the data that we receive, it might spur us to say, okay, that employer is reporting employees, but we have no record of coverage. So that's kind of like a background thing that the information we have coming in is trying to tie out. And when there's an exception, again, I'll use that example of we have record of an employer reporting employees, but they don't have coverage. That would then go to something where we'd say, okay, let's look at that and see why they don't have coverage. Wage claim process. I won't belabor it. I would just explain in case you go through a wage claim with us that the process in general, again, it's employee driven. It's the employee or former employee's motion. How a wage claim works is they file a complaint or a claim with us. We then give notice to the employer and say, here's a claim. What do you say about it? You have 10 days to object. After you object or whatever, we then go back to the claimant and say, okay, this is the employer's response. Do you want to go forward with a hearing? And then the department would hold a hearing. So I won't belabor that point. I just bring it up that you might get correspondence from us talking about wage claims. And sometimes folks think that a wage claim is the same as an inspection, and it's not. Just before I get into the issues we uncover in brief, I wanted to touch upon what might happen or should be happening in an inspection if you are inspected. I already touched upon the fact that typically these things start with a complaint. If we get a complaint and we feel as though it's a valid complaint worthy of additional action, that would cause us to say, okay, we're going to review and prioritize and then ultimately assign that complaint to an inspector. When the inspector gets that assignment, they would then at some point thereafter, based on prioritization, they would go to the employer and provide a notification or notice of inspection. After they provide the notice of inspection, they would then go through the actual act of inspecting the employer. And we'll talk a little bit more about the activities involved in that as we go forward. So notice of inspection, what is that? It's just a document that the employer receives from us saying, we're performing an inspection and here's the records that we need, or here's the information that we need. One thing I just want to highlight on this is I think that sometimes there's not good communication or collaboration. It's not always the employer's fault. Sometimes I think we could do a better job of collaborating or communicating on these notices. And what I mean by that is if there's questions about what we're looking for, if we give you this notice of inspection and you don't understand what we're asking for, or you think that you can provide it, but in a different way, just talk about it. Let's talk about it and see, again, what's the easiest way for you to provide these materials? Are there alternative ways for you to provide these materials? We should be having those discussions. And again, certainly, if you have questions about what we're asking for, ask those questions. There should be opportunities for us to talk about these things and make sure that the right information is getting there. What we're doing during an inspection is we're primarily doing a records review. We're looking at records. Again, when we give that notice of inspection, we'll be asking for employee files, we'll be asking for payroll, time, all of those things. And what we're trying to do is say, okay, based upon those files and based upon the activities and based upon the statutes going on in the background, is everything working out? I would just highlight the part I've put in bold is that records or the lack thereof, they do tell a story. And what I mean by that is if we're getting complaints, from employees, and they're saying, my time never adds up to what I thought I worked, they're not paying me in full, or, they changed my pay and they didn't tell me. If we're getting complaints like that, and then we go in and do an inspection and you have no records, or your records are all over the place and they're, nobody can follow them. I just point out that, again, that's not a proof positive that you're definitely in violation or have compliance problems. I just highlight that, records do tell a story. And again, oftentimes they are the backdrop of what we're doing. In addition to looking at records, we're going to do employee interviews. We do understand that sometimes there's disruption to that, but it is important for us to talk to the employees because, again, whether we've gotten a complaint from one person or several people, it's really important that when we go to the business, we actually get a sense of, the broader scope of that. So we should be talking to people and getting a sense of what's happening or not happening. Additionally, there'd be employer interviews. They would talk to the employer and they should be talking to the employer. One thing I highlight there is this is, again, something I think we could be at times better at, we being the department, is really, I think that, again, it should be an interactive process where if we're looking at records and we're seeing problems, I hope our inspectors are then talking to the employer or the managers and saying, hey, we're not seeing this. Is there a reason we're not seeing this? Because sometimes what happens is we ask those questions and the employer is like, oh yeah, no, I have another file, or this is where I keep those. But again, that it should be that type of interaction that should be happening. Lastly, and before we get into the actual issues that we deal with, is just the finalization of inspection. So after we go through an inspection, if we find stuff, or even if we don't find anything, we would then finalize the inspection. And what that means is we put together a report with our findings, if any, and then the inspector should be meeting with the employer to go over what that report says. I'll talk more about informal resolution and formal hearing kind of at the end. But I just highlight the fact that there are paths forward. If there is an inspection, even if there are purported problems that we've cited, there are a couple of paths forward, and usually we're able to work things out, I think, in a fair fashion. So in terms of, the things that we deal with, I have the list here and then I'll go through them in more depth, but the list that you're seeing on the screen now before you, these are the issues that we most regularly encounter in the context of our inspections or our encounters with the hospitality industry. I would note I'm going to pay particular attention to youth labor. I'm also going to end paying particular attention to minimum wage. When we talk about minimum wage in hospitality, we're not talking about people necessarily failing to pay minimum wage. We're talking about the tipped laws, or our laws related to tipped employees. Those are found within New Hampshire's minimum wage law. The other items on here, I will say as I go through these, and again, I'll give some of them shorter shrift than others. Certainly some of these, I think you'd look at them and say, oh, well, I would never do that, or that would only be a nefarious employer, an unsophisticated employer. Again, I'm just highlighting these are the things when I ask them, what do we most regularly encounter in hospitality? These are the types of things that have come up. So I'll go through each of them in turn, talking a little bit more in depth about them. In terms of payment of wages due, again, I think most often when we talk about, oh, people are not paying wages due, a lot of times people spark to mind this idea of just a bad employer saying, oh, I'm not going to pay you what I owe you. Oftentimes when we're citing payment of wages due, it's not so much an employer that's just stiffing people. It's more that for various reasons, not all time worked is being accounted for. One of the big issues that we deal with, and we do come across hospitality, I'm not saying this is necessarily with the membership of this organization, but we do deal with hospitality and folks in the restaurant industry who, they have a schedule that they put staff to, and then there's punches, or they have a timekeeping system. And I will say sometimes we come across instances in which, the employer is paying to schedule. And again, of course, as obvious as it sounds, that's not correct. You'd be paying to time worked. We also come across these issues where people are doing missed punches or just failing to punch in or punch out more regularly. The failing to punch out is the problem. And again, that sometimes leads to these issues where, okay, we have timekeeping records, and then we have payroll records. And as an inspector, when we're looking to say, do those match up, sometimes those present as problematic. Earlier, when I was talking about that notion about records telling a story, I always highlight when we talk about time worked that, again, understanding that we're complaint driven, You understand most people calling us, they're calling us because they're believing they're not being paid what they're owed. A lot money is what gets people to call more than anything. They call with other questions, but primarily they're calling about something that's affecting their paycheck. Whether real or imagined, they think something's affecting their paycheck. So when we get calls about, hey, my time doesn't add up, I worked 38 hours, but my check said I worked 33, or whatever the story is, if we then go into an employer and look at the records and we're seeing these types of, okay, there's differences between the punches and what the payment is, and the employer is telling us, well, that's because they worked to schedule, but they missed punches. I just point out that those are sometimes some of the problems that we grapple with. And again, it's not to say we assume all employers are bad. I would just say that sometimes when the inspectors have a complaint where a couple employees are saying our time is being changed, and then we look and the time is being changed, sometimes it begins to at least form some suspicions of potential problems. It's really important when we're talking about those missed punches to have some process in place to correct and properly provide prompt payment. And what I mean by that is there are instances in which it's the employee's fault, and I'll say it up front, it's the employee's fault. They mess up how they punch in or punch out. But then when they let the employer know, if there's like long lags in how long it takes for that issue to be corrected, then that can present as a problem again in terms of wages not being paid when due. Dealing appropriately with short breaks, I just highlight the fact that through regulation, the New Hampshire Department of Labor has adopted the federal conventions of what constitutes time worked. Accordingly, we have that sense of short breaks, meaning those de minimis breaks of not an unpaid 30-minute meal period, but those shorter breaks that whether that they should be compensated and that they're not something that should be deducted. The other issue we come through, and again, this has popped up in hospitality, which is I'm highlighting it. It's not the most frequent thing, but it does sometimes pop up, is if you do have any salaried folks, there are very limited instances. If you look at 275-43B, there are very limited instances in which you're able to prorate a salaried individual's employee. I will say that we do have some instances in which there's a salaried employee, let's say for sake of discussion, they were to work 5 days a week. They didn't work a day, the employer prorates it, to 4 days or the 4-day equivalent. And again, that's problematic. So in terms of, some things I would look at relative to seeing if I'm in good stead or good standing relative to payment of all wages due, I think you should ask yourself how and why are alterations made to an employee's time. Again, we have seen, I'm not suggesting that it's members of this organization, but we have seen instances in which prior to processing payroll, someone's going through and just editing all of the employee's time. Ask yourself why that's happening and whether it makes sense. In terms of this notion of correcting time, ask yourself how, if an employee if there has been a missed or a late punch, how is that corrected and when is it corrected? And then lastly, and this is probably the simplest one, how and when are adjustments made to a salaried employee, if you have any? I would ask myself, how and when do we make adjustments to a salaried employee's pay? Because again, there's highly limited and explicit circumstances. Youth labor. So this is one we definitely want to highlight. Youth labor is one of those topics where there is a lot of confusion and complexity around it. I would note a couple of years ago, this organization, Mike was at the legislature, and there was this initiative to kind of mirror or map to the federal laws exactly, or more closely mirror the federal laws, at least relative to 16 and 17-year-olds. That ultimately was not successful. And I would say that in part, that not being successful has probably led to some more confusion, because what was trying to happen was a simplification thing. And I think arguably what ended up happening was slightly more complicated. It does allow for additional hours to be worked, but it's a little bit more complicated. So again, I think this organization was coming from a good place of trying to streamline things. And I think ultimately through the legislative process, it was made a little bit more complicated. When we're talking about youth labor, a couple things to really keep in mind is the fact, first of all, there's certain permissions that need to be in place. I don't know in terms of the audience what you folks are dealing with in terms of engaging youth, but there's basically two categories of youth. You have under 16, and then you have 16 and 17-year-olds. Anyone 18 or older is an adult. But when you're talking about 15 and 16 or under 16, and then you're talking about 16 or 17, those are kind of the two categories. When we're talking about the permissions that need to be in place for under 16, you're looking at a youth certificate. Now, I will be honest and say our website's not the best, but we have tried of recent on our website to make it more apparent relative to youth labor. We have a youth labor brochure up. We also have a youth labor button up that kind of talks to you. If you press that, it's going to try and take you quickly to where you can get the forms for these permissions. But you're talking about for 16 or under 15 and 16, you're talking about a youth certificate. For 16 and 17, you're talking about parental permission. Those need to be in place and should be in place, signed, documented in the file before work is performed. I will say a lot of times we come in to do inspections and this issue, and it might seem like a minor issue. And I hopefully we handle it as a minor issue, but we see these issues where, you know, it's not dated until after the person started or things like that. Again, those should be in the file in advance of the individual starting work. In terms of this next bullet where it talks about hourly standards, I think that this is really where some of the complexity comes in, because you have multiple things going on here. When you're talking about hours for youth labor being able to work, you have a couple of things. One, you have, again, those buckets of 15, 16 or under 16, and then you have 16 and 17. So you have two buckets in terms of what those hours work. You also have federal and state standards on the hours. So I'll kind of go through those in some depth. Again, I would encourage you on our website, we have a brochure that kind of lists the hours out. I'm sorry, Amy, is there a question or?
Yeah, sorry, I was going to let you finish your thought, but we do have a question. Can an employee be paid per diem for hospitality positions with variable hours? For example, a position with typical morning and evening hours with the potential for occasional extra hours based on business levels.
So we'd want to see it, but you can have per diem employees. There's no, in terms of that, there's multiple ways in which you can engage folks. As long as they're being paid, you know, minimum, you'd want to make sure that the per diem, they're at least being paid minimum wage for the hours that they're working under that arrangement. But there's no prohibition in terms of saying hospitality folks can't be per diem.
Thank you.
The most important thing when you're setting up these types of engagements is, what does the notification say? Like, it would want to be very clear saying you are paid this, this is how you qualify for that. And then again, on the back end, you just want to be ensuring that whatever hours are worked under that arrangement, they're at least making minimum wage. Okay, so in terms of the hours, or talking about the hourly requirements, if you're talking about folks under the age of 16, they can't work earlier than 7 a.m. and they can't work later than 9 p.m. One thing I would point out, the feds would say not earlier than 7 and not later than 7 p.m. unless it's the summer, when they could work to 9 p.m. So I just point that out to say federal is a little stricter than state in terms of the hours of operation that the under 16 can work. In terms of the hours that they can work, and I'll just highlight these in general. Again, I would refer you to our website. You can get our brochure that lists these out in a tabular format. But in terms of the hours that they can work, you're again talking about for under 16, you're talking about no more than 3 hours on a school day. During a school week, no more than 23 hours. And you're saying a full vacation week, no more than 48. So again, that's for under 16. For 17-year-olds, or 16 and 17-year-olds, they can only work 10.25 hours in a day. They can't work more than 30 hours in a week if it's a full school week. And then this is where the legislative change from a couple years ago went into effect. If it's not a full school week, then it's this sliding scale. So if it's only 4 days, they can work 40.25. If it's 3 days or less, they can work 48. So there is some complexity to that. And I will just acknowledge that there's some complexity to that. What I would say is that the most important thing is that you're aware of the relevant limitations. I would say that sometimes the problems we see relative to youth labor, oftentimes it is hourly limitation violations. And sometimes what we're seeing happening, and we do see it happen in hospitality, is, let's say for sake of discussion that we're talking about a 16-year-old or a 17-year-old, and they can only work 30 hours in the given week. If that person was scheduled to work 30 hours and they worked late one shift or worked late 3 shifts, then of course they're going to go over that 30 hours. I would say that this is one of those times where when we do inspections, we sometimes get this reputation for, oh, you guys, even if I was 15 minutes over, you cited it. That sometimes does happen. I would say that we try and focus more on those times where it's like a systemic, like if the kid every week is working over, or if the kid's working significant hours over the limitation. Those are the ones we try and pay particular attention to. But again, I think a lot of times what we're seeing as an issue is the schedule. If there's only 30 hours and you schedule right to 30 hours, then you better be making sure that all of the punches are precise and that they're only working those hours that you've scheduled them. I'm sorry, Amy, is there a question?
We have 2 questions.
Okay.
One, do minors need to file school forms to work yearly?
No. So are you saying like if you filed it once, would they need to file it the next year? No, once it's on file with the employer, it should be good. If they went to another employer, they would need to get it again. But if the employer has the permission for them, it would be good.
Okay. And then the next question is, in regards to 14 and 15-year-olds, does this cause a non-compliance with federal audit because the federal supersedes the state?
Yes, you would, if you're looking at, if FLSA, if federal labor law applies to you, which it does for most hospitality folks because of the use of credit cards and the revenues associated. If federal law applies, then you would be looking to follow the stricter of the two, because otherwise you'd be good with us. Let's use the example of where the feds say they can't work past 7 p.m. We say they can work till 9, but if the feds ever did an audit, you'd be in some issues. I would say our folks, I think, do highlight that if they've gone and done an inspection and they see someone that's okay with us, but they would have the problems with the feds. I think we try and highlight that, but it is a really good question. And it is one of those areas where I think there's added complexity because there's ultimately 2. From a compliance perspective, you should be following the stricter of the 2.
Thank you.
In terms of the other big, so outside of hours, and again, concerning hours, I would encourage you, and I can send it to Mike after this, but again, our website's not great, but on our website, there's this brochure that lists out all of those hours and the limitations. So I really just encourage you to pay attention to those things, encourage you to be aware when you're scheduling. A lot of employers that we've dealt with that have a lot of youth employees that don't have problems, the way they've done it is through scheduling. They kind of build in a cushion. I would note, I understand the pressures and how hard it is to find help and good help. So I understand why it's not always easy to have those artificial limitations in, but I just highlight that that's something a lot of employers with youth have done, because then if you have a kid that, works an extra half hour or for whatever reason, just doesn't get out on time, you're not running into it. The last thing I always highlight when we talk about youth in hours is there are instances in which people are swapping shifts. And that's something to be cognizant of, is that if you have a kid that's on, you built his schedule or her schedule to not exceed hours, but then they swap with someone else, sometimes that runs into problems as well, because you can imagine that if someone's not keeping an eye on that, it could quickly become an issue. The next thing I would highlight is hazardous orders. So hazardous orders, for what those are, is the U.S. Department of Labor has issued these hazardous orders where they've highlighted certain things that kids are allowed to do or not allowed to do. The hazardous orders are pretty extensive. It's a big document. Again, it's something that I would say that it's important to be cognizant of when you hire youth labor, there are definitely things that they can't do and they're actually precluded from doing. The thing there is to err on the side of caution. This is something where I would say off the top of my head, I can remember Mike calling me maybe half a dozen times just saying, hey, Rudy, what about, and then, name the piece of equipment or whatever the tool is. And then it's something when someone names something, you then have to go look at those hazardous orders. Always feel free to call us with questions on those things. The hazardous orders, like I said, there's something that have to be looked at and analyzed because they're not always as apparent as one would hope. And again, I just highlight the fact that it's something to be cognizant of, that when you hire someone, be sure that what you're hiring them to do is something that they can actually do. And again, I know people have businesses to run, aren't always looking to talk to us, but if you have any questions on hazardous orders, the best advice I can give you, talk to Mike or call us or ask about it, ask before you run into any issues. Just in terms of self-checks dealing with employment or compliance issues with youth employment, make sure that folks who are in charge of scheduling are aware of those hours. Again, I understand it probably sounds like I'm assuming all employers are unsophisticated. I don't. I understand many of you guys are more sophisticated than we are. I just point out that we have inspected restaurants where part of the issue is when we're talking to the employer, it ultimately turns out that the person that was building the schedules, they were not aware of the hours. They were not even aware of if the kids' ages or that the age mattered. So make sure that they're aware of that. Do you have any type of, I don't know the systems that everyone uses for keeping track of time, but we've seen some employers that actually baked into their system, if the youth gets near those hours, they get some type of indication. And that's really helpful for several reasons. Probably, obviously to imagine what those reasons would be. I already talked about the swapping schedule. And then in terms of permissions, I would just encourage you, if you have youth, pull that file and see, are the permissions in there? If the permissions are in there, then you're all set. But again, all too often when we go in and request files, we'll say, okay, do you have any youth working for you? Once the youth are highlighted, we'll look through those files, and if they don't have a permission, that's a problem. So I would encourage you, just take a random sample, pull one youth file and see what type of shape you're in. Record keeping, I won't belabor this because I already touched upon it in part when I was talking about payment of wages or all wages due. But record keeping is something that we've come across in hospitality. And I don't pretend to, this is not all bad employers or people looking to cheat a system. There are sometimes issues where the record keeping, the processes themselves, one of the big ones that comes up, if you look at 80303F, that's a lab rule. It talks about the fact that when there's edits to a time record, there should be some acknowledgement of the employee. So again, think of the example we referenced earlier where the employee, it's their fault. They missed the punch or they didn't, punch in properly for whatever reason. They tell their manager or whoever is handling the payroll or timekeeping corrections, they affect the correction. The regulations are then looking for some type of acknowledgement. We've seen electronic acknowledgements where the employee can go in and look at it and they can just, click and say, yes, I acknowledge the above edits are true and accurate. We've seen handwritten ones where they're just acknowledging it. The idea is to just be acknowledged. And again, I just want to be clear, this is not us saying that, we don't understand there's an obligation to this or it's somewhat onerous. We absolutely do. But the key to record keeping, or the intent of the record keeping law, is just to make sure that there's true and accurate records, which is why I think there's so much attention paid to when you change a record. Let's make sure that the affected employee has the opportunity to say that, yes, that's a valid change. When we're talking about self-check, sorry, Amy, go ahead.
You can finish your thoughts before you come to me, but thank you. What is the minimum age for youth to work in the summer?
So I believe federally it can't be below 14, but I think in New Hampshire, that it can go all the way down to 12, but let me confirm that. I want to confirm that. I don't think we have many 12-year-olds working in the state outside of caddies and newspapers. I want to confirm that, but I think federally 14 is as low as it can go. So that's the safest bet. But I will confirm that and I'll follow up in writing, because again, my understanding is state law is it's 12, but I'll confirm that.
Okay, thank you.
In terms of self-checks on record keeping, again, I would look at if you have a time record and there's edits, are they acknowledged? It's as simple as that. I will say that oftentimes what we do when we do an inspection, if an employers, and most of the employers we do deal with now, even some of the smallest ones, they have electronic timekeeping systems. Most every electronic timekeeping system, and to be honest, every timekeeping system of an electronic nature that I'm familiar with has what they call an edit audit report. And an edit audit report basically is, they press the button and it spits out, a report showing all of the edits to that given time record. And typically what we do when we do an inspection is we say we want a copy of the edit audit report. And you should be, if I was an employer, I on occasion, I'm not saying do it every day, I'm not saying even every week, or maybe every week, but I wouldn't do it every day. Someone could be looking at that and saying, okay, when we're changing time, is it being acknowledged? Also ask yourself, why is the correction made? Why was it something that, we found out? Was it something that the employee asked for? Look at those types of things. And the reason I bring this up is because there have been circumstances where we've had employers who are not necessarily aware of the fact that their managers or the folks that handle payroll or the folks who handle different things for them are making all of these adjustments. And sometimes, and again, I'm not trying to cast aspersions, but sometimes there's instances in which, the managers are under pressure to manage payroll or to manage budget or do these different things. And they're making changes. And it's like, someone should be looking in the background saying, okay, those changes are happening. Why did they happen? And if they're valid, okay, but are they acknowledged by the employee? So I won't beat it to death, but record keeping is important because it's one that comes up. And again, understanding that most people are calling us and saying, I wasn't paid what I was owed, or I feel as though they're not keeping my hours accurately. If we then go run an edit audit report and it looks like people are changing time every single day and there's no employee acknowledgements, again, not saying it's automatic case closed, but again, that's to us suggestive of potential issues. Notifications, this is another one that it seems really simplistic, and I think that it's something that's easy to check on, but with notifications, it's just this idea that there are certain documents or notifications that need to be provided in writing to employees. They should be in the file, and these are ones that are easy to check. I always say to an employer that notifications, as onerous as they might sometimes be, they are very protective to employers. And what I mean by that, I referenced earlier wage claims or the wage claim process. Many times wage claims that are filed with this department can be easily dispensed with if the employer has good notifications in place. If you have notifications on how vacation time is handled at separation, if you have notifications on file about when and where pay has been changed or a person's pay rate has been changed, those types of things, again, they are a burden, they are paperwork, but they're very protective of employers because, again, then when someone calls or someone says or someone suggests that something's not happening, if you can look in the file and the file tells the story and the employer can say, see, it's all there, that usually gets rid of this stuff in short order. I'm highlighting here this payout of accrued leave just because it's something that comes up really often across the spectrum for all types of employers. As you might know, in New Hampshire, there's not a benefit law in the sense of there's no required law that says individuals are required to get vacation time or accrued time. Instead, what the law says is the law says that, employers' policy controls. So an employer can say, I'm giving vacation time or accrued time, or I'm not. Similarly, an employer can say, okay, I give you 2 weeks vacation or accrued time. And when you leave, if you haven't used it, you lose it. Or you leave and I pay you out the time that you have on the books. This is something that employees call us at time of separation. We get calls on this all the time because people have this sense that they are owed that time. And I will say sometimes employers even have really good notices where they explain how the policy works. And sometimes employees, I think, just disregard that because intuitively they feel, well, I earned the time, it's accrued time, it's mine. So I'm just highlighting it here because even though I've seen some good notices, we also have dealt with a number of employers and employers in hospitality who they haven't necessarily spelled that out. And so when folks leave, while that doesn't mean that you have to pay them because the policy or practice could have been that you don't pay them, I just point out if you have that notification in place, which you should by law, then that's good protective measure for you. The last thing I would say relative to this, the payout of accrued leave is that's something to just be cognizant of because on occasion there are legislative bills. I know Mike in this organization keeps track of bills that would affect employers, but there are bills out there pretty much every session, at least the last 4 sessions that I'm aware of, where there's been bills saying this time or accrued time would have to be paid at time of separation. So it's just something to be cognizant of, not saying that bill is going to pass, just saying it comes up every session. Hi, Amy.
Hello, we have a question. What are those limited situations that you referred to in regards to a salaried employee's pay can be prorated?
So the clearest example is if the person has not worked at all during a pay period. So say that during a given pay period, for whatever reason, the person performed no work. They were home the whole time. Then you could pay them nothing. So that's the clearest example. And that's most often where employers will come into issues because sometimes what happens is obviously if the person didn't work at all, that makes sense. But if the person works 2 out of the 5 days and then they try and prorate it, the way the law is written, the fact that they've performed any work in the salaried period entitles them to all of it. So the clearest example is they've performed no work because the statute says any work. So if they perform no work, you can cut their salary. The other one is if they have requested it. So there are instances in which if you have leave policies in place, and the person is saying, okay, I've used or exhausted all of that all of the leave policy available, and I want to take another day off, understanding that it's unpaid, then that's another instance in which you could prorate it. That's the one that's in the law. I will say we don't see that often. It doesn't come up too often that the person is, voluntarily requesting it. Because I would say sometimes if the person understands the law, which they don't often do, but if the person understood the law, they're not going to ask for it voluntarily. So that one doesn't come up too often. The other one deals with if the person is subject to some type of disciplinary suspension. There could be instances you'd have, and this is something you'd really want to look very closely at. But if there's like a progressive discipline system in place and the person's been in that discipline system and they've been subject to a suspension and that's kind of why they've been out, there could be instances there where you're able to prorate it. So they're very explicit. And I would say the one that's most applicable is they don't work at all. Typically, if the person works some hours, they're going to be entitled to it. Most often when we see this issue, it's at times where a person is being terminated or something of that nature.
Thank you.
Two-hour minimums. So again, under RSA 275-43A, in short, the law says that if at the employer's request an individual reports to work, that they should be at least given 2 hours pay. There are exceptions to this. I think the most applicable exceptions in the hospitality industry, and I'm subject to correction if Mike has other examples. The one exception that we don't see so often in hospitality is in our regulations, there's this concept that if there's a certain position that at time of hire was told, hey, when you come in, you're only going to come in for an hour at a time. then when that person comes in and works the hour, you'd only have to pay them the hour. You wouldn't have to pay them the 2 hours. I'm not saying that couldn't exist in hospitality. You could, when the person is hired, have that conversation. That's how you could schedule them. That's how you could work with them. I'm just saying we have not regularly seen that in hospitality. Most often that comes up at folks who work at gyms, like if someone teaches an hour-long, exercise class, it comes up. The more applicable exceptions are that if somebody leaves, if the person says, hey, I want to leave, and I'm sick, family emergency, then if that's documented, that the person, they voluntarily left and it was for one of the reasons, sick, family emergency, something of that nature, that if that's documented in the file, you could say, you would show us that, hey, that happened. I would say that the biggest thing here is that, there's a distinction between an employer saying, hey, it's not busy, you can leave, versus the employee saying, hey, I want to leave, I want to get home to my family or whatever. So that's the clearest thing. And again, we have seen where people are saying, hey, it's slow, I'm bored, I want to leave. Again, unless it's for one of those documented reasons, you'd be looking at the 2 hour minimum. And it's something we do deal with quite often. Amy, do you have a question?
Back again. 2 questions. One, a follow-up from the salaried prorating. If an employee resigns with effective date in the middle of the salary bi-weekly period, so example, if they worked one of the 2 weeks, how is that handled?
Yeah, so under E, if you look at 275-43B E, we have tempted to say that or E2, employers may prorate a salary to a daily basis when a salary employee terminates of his own accord before the end of a pay period. So if the person terminates of their own accord, they end it, then you could prorate it. So again, the most often we see this is when the person's terminated not of their own accord.
And then this one is in regards to the 2 hour minimum. What happens if someone just walks out on a shift?
So if they just walk out, again, the problem there would be no documentation. This is somewhere where people get frustrated with us. I think in practice, what might happen is that we would probably cite it as saying no documentation. I would hope, and I can't promise this has always happened, but I would hope that if there was some notation that, hey, the person just walked out, my hope would be is that we would not issue any type of penalty for that or anything of that nature. So I would say the short answer is that the exception says that they're leaving and they're doing it because of, personal, family, or illness. If the person just walks out and you don't know any of that, you're probably going to have a hard time, documenting it exactly and whatever. But like I said, I would hope that we would not come to problems over that. I would hope we would just maybe highlight it and say, okay, there wasn't documentation here, and then work through it. But I think it's a good question because sometimes I think that's why employers get very frustrated with us. Because if you look at that law, the exception is highly limited. It's very specific. One thing I always highlight when we talk about the 2 hour minimums is it talks about, people will say, well, where is the documentation located? Like, what am I supposed to do? We've had all sorts of solutions to this. Sometimes people just like append an email. Sometimes people just have like a little note box on the record that's just, acknowledged in some way. I guess there's not like a simple answer. And in some ways that's helpful because again, you could be however you want to just get the documentation there, as long as there's some way that sometime after the fact, if I were to see, okay, Rudy left and he was only there an hour and 15 minutes and you paid him an hour and 15 minutes, why didn't you pay him 2? What's the easiest way for you to call up? Oh, well, that's because he left to go, because he was sick. So that's what I would say is, again, I don't have a simple answer is this is the only way to do it. really any way you have of getting that documentation readily at hand that you could produce it, or whoever's doing payroll could look at it and say, okay, yeah, this is an appropriate instance of paying less than 2 hours. That's the way I would do it. Authorization to work, RSA 275A4A, undocumented workers. This one is akin to the youth permissions, in the sense that the real importance here is this stuff is supposed to be in place prior to time of hire. I would say that we are seeing increased incidents of this. One of them we did just, there were a couple of restaurants we just dealt with where I think that they quite candidly acknowledged, hey, given the pressures in hiring and stuff, this is the route we took in terms of getting employees. I would just highlight the fact that the statute's very specific in saying that there needs to be authorization of work, the way authorization to work in the country, and there's various means of satisfying that. Primarily, you're talking about the I-9, getting the I-9 filled out. I don't think the statute says I-9. The law says sufficient to satisfy federal requirements, which is why you're most typically dealing with the I-9. And in terms of a self-check here, similar to what I said about the youth, just pull a file. Every file should have the I-9. I would note sometimes we've run into employers where they don't have the authorization to work on file. And their reason will be, and I'm not trying to make a joke or make light of it, but their reason will be, well, I knew him since he was a kid, so I know he can work here. And again, I just point out the statute specific in terms of what it's looking for, and whether you saw the person, from their date of birth onwards. We're looking for just that documentation, and it is something that's come up, and we understand in part where it's coming from. Go ahead, Amy.
Is the documentation within 3 days of starting or the hiring date? Is there a time frame that paperwork has to be done in?
We're looking for it prior to the person beginning work. So it should be prior to employment. So it should be that stuff is in hand, basically the day that they're starting. It should be, you should have it sealed up.
Thank you.
And we understand sometimes they come in that day and fill it out. It's on that day, but that's what we're looking for, is prior to them starting, you should have all the stuff there to get it sorted out. Deductions, and I promise I'm going to get to tips shortly, but in terms of deductions, this is something where, again, similar to the conversation on prorating a salary, deductions, there's a list of those instances in which it's appropriate to do deductions. And I would say the list is pretty broad, and the list even has some catch-alls in it, but I would just point out that there is a list. And if you're seeing or you're making deductions to an employee's pay, you should be ensuring that the deduction is for a reason that corresponds or could be attributed to something on that list. This again comes up at times, not all that often, but I would say Mike on a couple occasions has called us. We've had questions about student loan garnishments or other things like that. So it does come up, and I just always encourage folks, be familiar with 275-48. And if you're seeing deductions from an employee's pay or making deductions, just make sure that you're able to map it out to something on that list. The only other thing I would highlight there is this notion that, what I referenced earlier, people complaining about their pay. People complain all the time if they get their paycheck and there's deductions and they can't understand what the deductions are for. So I just always encourage employers, relative to their processing of payroll and whatever systems they're using, as a self-check here, I would always make sure that whoever deals with employees on their pay, can they explain what the deductions, where they're coming from? Because if it's not noted or if it's not clear on that statement, even if it's a valid reason, that's just going to cause questions, and it's going to cause confusion. And potentially, depending upon how vague it is, there could be some compliance issues. So, sorry, Amy, go ahead.
I'm back. I have a couple of follow-up questions. One in regards to the 3-day question with starting and hiring and the documentation. The question is, the federal law is within 3 days. Is New Hampshire different?
I'll confirm. My understanding is that the way 270 our law works, I'll look at it right now, but my understanding is it says that documentation has to be in prior to employment, but I will look.
Okay, yeah, because just the follow-up was sometimes somebody might forget an ID or something, and so the business owner might give them a few days to just get everything in order. All right, so we'll confirm that.
Yeah, so the way that this reads, if you look at 275A4A, no employer may employ any employee without obtaining documentation showing the employee's eligibility to work in the United States. So I think our issue is, now again, I would hope that if we inspected somebody and they had it and it was within 3 days, I would hope, I'm hoping we're handling that, in a somewhat delicate fashion. I hope we're just noting that. And to be fair, maybe let's change the law, but the way the law reads right now, where it talks about no one shall employ prior to obtaining, I think that's why we're coming down and saying the way that it says no one shall employ prior to obtaining suggests that you should not employ prior to having in hand that documentation showing that it's appropriate. So that's a good question.
Great. And then the other one jumps back a couple things. Does the 2-hour minimum apply to these two scenarios? Scenario 1, if an employee does work from home, such as responding to emails on a non-scheduled day.
No, so the key there would be non-scheduled. I would also say that the reporting to work question calls into question whether they've reported to work, but most clearly in that example, they're not scheduled. The 2-hour law is sometimes referred to as the reporting law, because I think the concept there was you're telling the person, hey, report to the workplace. They get up, they drive, they do this, they do that. If you send them home in 15 minutes, I think the 2-hour was looked at as some type of reasonable approximation of the time it took to get there. So that's a good question, but if it's unscheduled, then clearly no.
Okay, so this one's somewhat similar, but a little bit different because they've actually traveled. So if an employee comes in on a non-scheduled day to catch up on hours and tasks because they didn't work a full shift earlier in the week.
Again, no, because it's not scheduled. So the 2-hour is really you told the person, come in and report to work.
Thank you.
This one I'll touch upon very briefly. I'll admit this in somewhat, just the department. I'll also use this as an example. Amy had asked yesterday to talk a little bit about COVID and vaccine mandates and implications that might have for employers and time worked. And I'll do that through this because of the safety vein. In terms of New Hampshire Department of Labor, we are not OSHA. OSHA is safety for private employers. But relative to private employers, the two things that we do enforce is safety summary plan requirement and joint loss management committee requirements. Those were put in place, I think, and Mike might know better than I do, but my understanding is those were put into place several years ago. It was some type of compromise where the workers' comp reimbursement rate went from 65 or 66% down to 60%. And then the notion was, but what we'll do is we'll make sure that employers are more cognizant of safety and creating more safe work environments to mitigate workplace injuries, which would lead to workers' comp. So I'm not trying to bore you with it, but I just point out that that's kind of the background of, okay, why does New Hampshire Department of Labor have these two safety requirements? The safety summary plan, very simply what we're talking about with that or joint loss management committee is that if you have 15 or more employees, you're required to have a safety summary plan and an active joint loss management committee. I am not an expert on those things. What I would encourage folks is that if you have 15 or more folks and you don't have those things, please give us a call because our safety inspectors will actually walk through very quickly how you can put together a short form summary plan. And basically all a safety summary plan is trying to do is in some ways it's like an inventory or acknowledgement of the most pressing safety concerns that your organization or entity would face. and then kind of some rules of the road or a roadmap to how you would address or handle some of those things. A joint loss management committee, it sounds, a little bit complicated or cumbersome, but pretty simply what it is it's a committee, and it should be made up of employer representatives and employee representatives. And that committee would meet, and they should meet at least quarterly. And what they do is they just talk about workplace safety. Doesn't have to be 6-hour meetings, but it's just in short dealing with workplace safety and some certain things to be cognizant of. And usually what they're doing is they're talking about, okay, geez, this place has had a lot of slip and falls, or, oh, geez, those stairs, people keep falling on those stairs. And then this committee should be looking at mitigating some of those things. In terms of what I would do here, again, if you have 15 or more employees, then you should be aware of these requirements. If you have 15 or more employees, do you have a plan? Do you have a committee? If you don't, please reach out to us. And as I said earlier, this is not you reach out to us. We basically hardly ever issue fines in this area. Really what we're doing here is we just want to make sure that employers have these things and they understand them. And what I would say is, again, and I'm not just trying to sell it or be hokey about it, but truly employers that are mindful of safety can actually save themselves money and save themselves lost time and all of those things. So I'll stop with the plugs of it, but I would just be cognizant of safety, summary and joint loss management committee. Pivoting from this, where I said that we are not OSHA. As we are not OSHA, the New Hampshire Department of Labor does not have a role, regulatory or otherwise, concerning what's happening at the federal level, where, as you know, or might know, the president has said that, he's looking for OSHA, federal OSHA, to issue rules and regulations concerning vaccine mandates. So we're not part of that enforcement effort. We're not part of developing those rules or, following up on those rules or certainly administering them. Where we do intersect with it, however, is that we have been asked by folks that, okay, if they're, if I'm sending people or requiring people to be vaccinated, or if I'm requiring people to be tested, is that time worked? And what we have done to date, this is the guidance we've given BIA, this is the guidance we've given anyone who's called and asked us, is if the employer is requiring these things, then we have, and by these things, I'm talking specifically about, requiring an employee to get vaccinated or requiring an employee to go and get tested. We would view those things as time worked. The reasons being for that is if you look at our concepts relative to issues of employer mandates, principally we have 275-57, which deals with employee expenses, employer expenses, namely being that if an employer mandates or requires some action or activity and there's attributable expenses, that those expenses should be, borne by the employer. Similarly, so that's in terms of the costs of these testing or vaccinations, which to date, there really haven't been costs to those things, but to the extent there were costs to those things, we would view it as being attributable to the employer as an expense. And in terms of time worked, if it's an employer mandate, if it's an employer obligation, then we would view it as time worked. Now, I would note that we have not seen, obviously, I don't think no one has seen what the OSHA rules look like. I don't think they've written them yet. When we've talked to the Federal Department of Labor, which OSHA sits under the Federal Department of Labor's umbrella, they have not yet given us a date certain as to when those rules had be issued. Those rules will be important because, again, if our concept is, if it's an employer mandate, the employer would have to pay for it. We want to see what those rules look like, because if the rules come out, and I imagine since they're coming from OSHA, they will be framed as an employer. They will tell employers, hey, employers, you need to get your people vaccinated, or you need to do these testings. If OSHA is telling the employers to do that, and then the employers turn around and tell their employees to do that, we would still view that as coming from the employer because it's a requirement of the employer. If, however, now it wouldn't be through OSHA most likely, but if there was just this blanket mandate on the state level or the federal level that every individual be vaccinated, or prior to returning to work, every individual, every Friday get tested, we would say, okay, that's an individual responsibility. It's not passed through the employer. And therefore, we would say that it's not employer mandated and the employer doesn't have to pay. So I apologize for kind of rambling on there. I'm not trying to talk in such hypotheticals, but I just want to be very clear that if it's an employer telling their people, we want you to get tested every Friday, or you need to go get vaccinated, the time attributed to those activities, we would consider time worked. And if there were a cost to those activities, we would consider those employer reimbursed. The employer would have to reimburse for those expenses or pay for those expenses. A couple of questions we've had from employers. Well, what if I have someone, and they take 6 hours to do it? Again, we understand the dilemma there. Did it really take 6 hours to do it? If you have some way of gauging that it didn't take them 6 hours to get tested or whatever, okay. But in principle, we'd be looking at, okay, how much time did it take, and pay them for that time. And if you dispute the time with them, that's a different issue. But at the end of the day, we'd be looking for the time work to be paid. The other question we've had is, well, what about when someone's in quarantine, or what about when someone was exposed and they need a test because they were exposed per public health guidance? Those instances we would say is not time worked. If someone's in quarantine, or if someone's getting like a clearance to come back to work because of an exposure, we would view that as more akin to right now, if people have sick time, if they have sick time, or if someone was out. People are often, I think, familiar with the concept of a return to work. Someone's out on medical leave, they need a return to work to return. Those types of activities we would say are not, the employer's not obligated to those things. So again, I apologize if I've in any way muddled those things. I'm just trying to bring up that, we've had questions about the COVID vaccine mandate, testing mandates. We've also had question about, quarantine and things of that nature. So I'm just trying to answer those. I'm happy if there's other questions on those. And I would say that there's still some uncertainty around it, but to date, that's the guidance that we've given out, and that's the positioning we've taken on it. Go ahead, Amy.
Back to the 2-hour minimum question. Again, does the employer need to pay 2 hours if they invite an employee to an optional 1-hour meeting that falls outside of their scheduled time?
I'd be interested in terms of the optional. So in a general sense, if it's not required, then my sense would be no. But, and I will ask, I can talk to the administrator about that, but based on the way the law is written, my sense is optional. If it's truly optional, and I'm not trying to torture it to death, but that's the way my mind works, is optional really optional? Is it something like, hey, you can go, but if you don't go to this, then you're not really a team player. But if it's truly an optional type of thing, then I think it perhaps, that could work.
Thank you.
Okay, so tips. So Mike and I had talked about tips. We've talked about tips many times, but I think tips really became an interesting issue and a dilemma in the context of COVID, because we've obviously seen now more than ever takeout and online ordering and things of that nature. And I'd be the first to admit that our statutes were not set up to necessarily handle an entirely online model or something of that nature. But before we get to those specific examples of tips, in the online context or the takeout context, just want to start with some of the building blocks, which again, some of you folks, I'm sure all of you folks are more familiar than I am with these concepts, but just want to make sure we touch upon them. Really what we're looking at is the idea that there's tipped employees, and in the context of New Hampshire, a tipped employee is someone who's directly receiving tips. And those tips, if they're in excess of the $30 a month, which is an incredibly low threshold, they could be considered or deemed a tipped employee, subject to that tipped rate. We also want to talk about tip pools and tip shares. We'll talk a little bit about those in more depth, but I just want to be aware of the fact that there are issues around pools and shares, namely the idea that participation by employees has to be voluntary, entirely voluntary. Incidental duties, so if you look at LAB 80302G, it brings into mind this concept of incidental duties. So within the regulations, it talks about this notion that a tipped employee, so let's use the most basic example of a waiter or a waitress. It's understood that the tipped employee, they will be waiting on customers, but there will be times in which they're not waiting on customers, and they might be doing duties such as folding napkins, preparing, things, things to the side. They're doing these incidental duties, which in some ways play into the service to their customers, of course, but they're not a tip producing activity. What I would say in this context is we've had some cases, some bad cases about this. When I say some bad cases, some cases where I don't think the department did as good a job as it should have or could have. And really what that spawned is we had long discussions with Mike and Chris Ferrentis, an attorney. And in those context of those conversations, we tried to come up with kind of shared or guidance that we could all agree with. My understanding is Mike makes that available to you folks. We have made it available, in part of the training for our inspectors. And really the guideposts there are trying to say, okay, we're trying to just do this balancing act of, we understand they're going to be engaged in these incidental duties. What we're really trying to guard against is, someone who comes in and they're, cleaning bathrooms for 4 hours of their shift. Because if they're doing that for 4 hours of their shift, they should be not being paid a tipped rate because they're not doing these tip duties. So it's kind of a nuanced concept. I do think that the guidance that largely was driven by Mike's efforts, I think it's a good tool. And truly, like what we're trying to do as a department is really hone in on those really egregious examples. And again, I think those egregious examples would be well outside the bounds of the guidance that we put together with this association. So again, I encourage you, work with this association, talk to Mike on these incidental duties. And I would say they're fact intensive. You have to look at the given situation, but I think the guidance that we put together collectively and collaboratively does put some parameters in place where even if they're not necessarily perfect, absolute bright lines, I do think there's guideposts that could inform action going forward. In terms of some of these specific issues we want to talk about in depth, I just want to highlight the idea of a tip pool and a tip share. And again, forgive me if you all know this, but I would just say we do sometimes deal with folks in the industry, maybe not members of this organization, but in the industry who use the term tip pool and tip share interchangeably, and they are different. And we do see very different issues related to them. So a tip pool is when directly tipped employees are participating in a pool. So people who are directly getting tips have voluntarily agreed to put their tips that they've received into a pool, and then they have some method of distributing those tips from the pool to those participants. Relative to tip pools, we really don't see that many issues. The biggest issues that sometimes come up with tip pools is management participation. I would say that federally, the federal law is very clear in saying that managers should not be participating in these types of arrangements. I would say state law is not that explicit, and I think state law actually would allow for if a manager was receiving tips, then arguably they can participate at, whatever. Sometimes the problem with managers participating is that a manager participating sometimes as seen as, okay, now it's no longer voluntary because now that management's involved, does it become per se coercive? I'm not saying it necessarily does. I'm just saying that's sometimes the issue that comes up. But again, I'm highlighting this managers around pools issue because the biggest complaints we get around tip pools is from employees telling us, the manager who's not, doing the job. They're just parked in the pool and they're pulling out of it. So that's something that has come up. But generally speaking, a tip pool, we do not see issues with. In terms of tip shares are actually very different. A tip share is when directly tipped employees, let's use the simple example of a waiter or waitress, the directly tipped employees are then voluntarily electing to share or provide a tip out to non-directly tipped employees. So that model where, let's say, the waiters and waitresses are getting tips and they're saying, okay, I'm going to give some of my tips to the bussers, or I'm going to give some of my tips to the hosts. Again, this is sometimes where we'll hear folks tell us, oh, it's a tip pool. And we say, well, that's slightly different than a tip pool because some of the participants are not directly tipped. So they're not pooling, they're instead just taking a tip out. Sorry, Amy, go ahead.
That's okay. 2 questions. Can you define a manager for the tip pool? What if they are an hourly event manager helping out in a specific event? And then is there a specific amount of the tip in a contract for the event manager?
So typically, is the event manager in the context of catering? Is that where the question's coming from?
I think so.
Okay, so
for a wedding, so a specific event, yes.
yeah, so oftentimes in those type of arrangements, if there is a tip specifically called out saying, hey, customers, we're charging and this person's getting that tip, that would be deemed appropriate. In terms of so we talked about tip pools, we talked about tip shares. So online issues. So this is something where I think it's probably always been a potential issue. And when I say an issue, I'm not saying it's a problem like people are necessarily doing something bad. This is though an issue where our laws were set up. Our law, when I talk about our law, 279-26B talks about tips, and it says tips are the property of the employee that receives them. That's the way the law is written. I would say that law was not written thinking about online orders, because the question then becomes who receives that tip. And I think that's where sometimes the dilemma comes up. Now, Mike has talked to me about different examples. I would say that we've had a whole host of things. We've had some employers that they have a system where, okay, the online orders come in and whoever provides service relative to getting those orders ready and getting those orders out in people's hands, they're all in a pool. And I would say that I understand that and it makes sense. I would just highlight that there could be issues where a given employee, if a given employee said, hey, I worked on that order, in that order, the person left a $50 tip and that $50 was mine, I would just say that there is an argument that could be made there that that person received that tip. I don't think it's a great argument. I understand people being frustrated. I'm just pointing out that the way the law is written, it says the person who receives the tip. And I think in this online world, we all have to look at who actually received the tip. And again, I understand why people have set up pools for that. I think pools appropriate. And you know what, if everyone agrees voluntarily to work within that pool, everyone, when I say work within that pool, everyone who's processing those orders, getting them ready, if everybody voluntarily says, yeah, let's put it all in a pool and then split it, that is completely appropriate because it's voluntary. I'm just pointing out the potential issue that you could have a given employee say, I keep track of all the orders that I work, and as such, I want this money. We've not really seen that come up. I would say we have not seen that as an issue. And I'll be honest, I don't even know how we would deal with it necessarily, because I don't know that we would be able to get good enough information to actually say, oh yes, more likely than not, that person really did hand. I think it would be difficult for us to do a wage adjustment or do a reallocation. So again, I'm just highlighting here that online, there is that issue of you have to ask yourself, who does that tip, who received that tip. I would highlight two things that we've seen employers do relative to this to give themselves more clarity. One was someone just got rid of the line. We have had, when I say someone, we've had a couple of employers just for their online ordering, they don't do a tip. I understand why. I think in some ways that eliminates the argument. I also understand why some employers might say no, because I want my employees to get those tips. So I'm not necessarily saying that's the way to go. I'm just saying employers in response to dealing with, because some employers called us and said, hey, can I get rid of that line? Because, you know, my people are fighting about it and I just don't want to deal with it. And there's nothing you can get rid of that line if you want. So that's one thing. The other thing, and I don't know, again, this is dependent somewhat on what your systems are set up as, is we had an employer, and this was only one. I'm sure there's others out there that have this, but we had an employer that every employee who took the order, so if an online order came in and they acted on it, their number was, they all had a number and their number was tagged to it. So then the employer, at the end of whatever relevant period they were running it, he or she would run it and it would then produce, okay, this person did these 17 orders and those tips were associated with it. Again, not saying everyone has the capabilities of doing that. I'm just saying that we have dealt with at least one employer who did that. Before I go on and on with the online takeout obviously has been around for a long time, longer than online. But I think we all could say that in the context of COVID, takeout, you know, more than we've ever seen. We got a lot of calls on, again, this idea of how do we work this? And I would say, again, that if everybody servicing the customers, if everybody who, you know, was bringing the food out or putting the food up or dealing with that, if everybody voluntarily said, yes, we're in a pool, and this is what we're going to do with that money, absolutely that works because it's voluntary. I again just highlight the issue that if we look at the law where it says the tip belongs to the employee who received that, if the person who actually brought the food out and got the tip is going to start saying, I received it and I don't want to participate, I do think that there is some exposure there for the employer in the sense of somebody could try and make that argument. I've always, you know, to me, the takeout is kind of in some ways like the tip jar. And I've always viewed the tip jar as a pool. But I would say that, you know, there are instances in which people could try and say that the tip jar or this takeout scenario or this online scenario, again, if someone's actually going to sit there with a journal and say, I serviced all of those customers and they gave me that tip, I'm just pointing out it is an argument. And again, we've not had an issue. I think a lot of people in this environment have been happy with how the pools have been handled. And there's been a lot of tips. So I think people have been okay with it. But I would say that some of our thoughts on that is if we dealt with it, we would just be looking, is it voluntary? And if it's not voluntary, then it should be. And then in terms of who does it belong to, that's an argument and it's fact dependent. And again, I would say in the most general sense from the department's perspective, whoever's you know, if I'm the person pulling it, handing it over, walking it out, that person has the clearest case to say that the order belongs to them or the tip belongs to them if they wanted to make that case. So I'm happy to take questions on that. And I know that there's some uncertainty there. I would just say for us, it's really a fact-intensive inquiry where we're trying to say, who received the tip? And then also we're looking at, is it voluntary? Is whatever model that's been arranged voluntary? Sorry, Amy, go ahead.
That's okay. I have a couple of questions. In terms of the tip pool, what about managers that are always part of a production?
So again, we have seen instances in which, and this was actually a law change a couple of years ago, where they tried to make clear that you could have the concept of pool. If you look at the original definition of pool, it was all people in the same job job categories. So again, let's say it had to all be waiters. They adjusted the law a couple years ago to say nothing would preclude a pool from sharing with others. And I think the reason, and I'm not trying to speak for the folks who were lobbying behind that effort, but part of what the notion there was is that, so for people in different job categories, and our point was, is if people are participating and they're putting tips in, they could take tips out. I would say the way the law is structured, in order to allow for these different job categories, they did kind of split the definition, but that's a really long, tortured way of saying, if they are participating in production and they're, in the case of, are they, do you know, for that example, are they coded in as that during that time?
I don't know the answer to that.
Because if they're coded in, then you don't even have to worry about this concept of other definitions. If they're not coded in, then the law could allow for it because of this notion of, okay, the pool could share with people even of a different job class. So that's a really long way of saying that that could work. I would just say that you'd want to be really careful that when managers are involved or getting pulled out at any time, we get the complaints, and I'm not saying in this example is a problem, but I'm saying sometimes what they're saying is, okay, the manager, you know, they were part of production, but then the employees call us and say, well, they say that the manager was doing that, but they were in the back room doing orders or doing this or doing scheduling or doing that. So I'm not saying it could never work. I'm just saying that that's sometimes where the complaints come from. So you just want to be very clear that, are they actually participating in that? And then if they're not, and then again, the voluntary piece, is it voluntary? Did everyone agree to it? If everybody agrees to it, then we'll see if it could work.
Okay, I think this is a similar veined question. If the employees involved in either a tip pool or a tip share situation are paid a minimum wage of $7.25 an hour or higher, can managers or owners take share of co-worked events, large parties, or direct allocations, typically based on hours worked or efforts? For example, $1 or percentage share to kitchen help, bussers, bar, etc.
No. So if the question is if you pay them at least $7.25, does the voluntary nature of these types of arrangements go away? It doesn't. The way the law is written is that the tip belongs to the employee who received it, and it can't go through a pool or a share unless it's voluntary. So I just want to be very clear on that we have had that question before about, well, I'm paying them at least minimum wage, so it doesn't apply. The law is not written to say an employee being paid a sub-minimum rate who receives a tip, the tip belongs to them. The law says tip belongs to the person who gets it, and it can't go through a pool or a share unless it's voluntary.
Okay.
I would say Mike asked a really good question last week, where Mike reached out and said that there was this notion of, could an employer just say to their customers, hey, we're charging you, similar, I think, to the question earlier about the contract. If you're just saying to your customers, we're going to charge you this percentage, or we're doing this, and then we're giving that to our back of the house or whatever, that we have nothing to do with that. That's something you could do if you decide, if someone decides. I understand there could be hazards to that. Some customers might not like it, but I just want to be clear. If you're saying to your customers, we 3%, you pay us this percent, and we're giving this to them, that's appropriate.
Two more questions. For tip pools, can the employee opt in and out on a daily basis?
So I understand that the impracticalities of that make it really obnoxious, but yes, if the employee, I think perhaps someone might say to the person, are you actually in or out? Like, I guess, and this is something where I point out that it's voluntary. The employer should not force it. And that can lead to these issues. But yes, someone would say, I think the employees or the other participants of the pool might have a say in saying, okay, we don't let this person do that. And that's not to like create like street justice. We're not trying to pit employees against each other. But I would just say that I think in the voluntary nature, if that doesn't work for the other participants, then it's not like the employer has to go to bat and let the person park in and out of it whenever they want. But in the general sense, if voluntary does mean that if everybody's okay with it, they could be, arranging it whatever ways they want.
So this kind of follows up on that. Can the manager intervene to ensure that the tip pool is operating fairly for the staff that is participating, or is the tip pool operated by the employees on their own?
So the way the law is written, and this has certainly caused some problems, the way the law is written is if the employees are seeking some type of assistance relative to the administration of the pool or the share, then the employee can take those types of actions. But again, it should be at the employee's behest. It should not be the employer just ad hoc jumping in and directing things. It should be more like questions. Additionally, at the employee's request, the employer can, they call it administering it. The employer rather, can take some, those actions relative to kind of effectuating some of it. The most important point, and sometimes this point is lost though, is it should be at the employee's behest. So it should be something where they're saying there's a problem with this, and then the employer is kind of looking at it and saying, okay, well, this is how it was, and seemingly this is what you guys had agreed to, so this is how it works. Again, it's a sticky situation. I would say the problems come up when the employer is doing it ad hoc, not at anyone's request.
Thank you.
So again, I know that tips, they come up. And again, we understand, we are mindful of, we're not in the industry, but we are mindful of the fact that tip shares and tip pools exist. And I just say that because we understand they're complicated. We understand that, employee morale is at issue and there's a lot of things involved in it. Really, from the department's perspective, we're just really looking at that idea of, is it voluntary? If it's voluntary, if the participants are okay with it, then it works. I mean, the law requires that it be voluntary. Also, if you understand that we are 99.9% of the time complaint driven, if it's voluntary, truly voluntary, we're never even going to hear about it because people are happy with it and okay. Again, the big issues we get is when people are getting mandates to them. And like I said, the management issue is interesting because a lot of times people will perceive management involvement as per se coercive. That's not always the case, but I think sometimes that spawns some of the issues or some of the problems. Last thing, and I know I'm kind of looking back, so those are the issues we deal with, but just before I wrap up, and I know I've gone a little bit over, I appreciate your indulgence. But just I want to highlight the fact that if we've gone in and inspected your business, if there's questions, if there's, we feel as though there's compliance concerns and we've cited things, I just want to highlight, again, you're going to get a summary of finding. It's a report where we say, this is what we see as being problematic or at issue. When you get that, you will soon thereafter get, if there is penalties, a civil penalty letter. And the civil penalty letter will then explain to you, okay, there's paths forward from here. Assuming there's problems, there's these paths forward. And the one path is through informal resolution. So employers always have the opportunity to resolve things with us informally. I encourage everyone, even if they really disagree with us, to first seek out informal resolution, because even if you try informal resolution, if you're not satisfied, you can then request a formal hearing. So I just point that out, as I always encourage folks to try and resolve things informally. What I mean by informal resolution is you meet with the department, you meet with the administrator, and you talk about the issues. You, first of all, if we've missed something, if we're just wrong factually, let us know and we can adjust from there. Also, if there's things you think we should consider where there is, aggravating circumstances, where there are good explanations, all of those types of things. Let's talk about it. Let's work it out. And I promise you that if you do that, and either prove us all wrong, or you acknowledge the issues, but demonstrate that you're committed to compliance going forward, I promise you that you'll get a fair and reasonable accommodation relative to the fines. We are not looking to penalize people to put them out of business. We're looking to educate folks. We're looking to encourage compliance. And if we see a commitment towards compliance going forward, I promise you, I think that you'll be satisfied with anything type of accommodation we come to on the fines, if there's any fines at all. Formal hearing is if you want to disagree on the law, if you think that we're misinterpreting the law and it's not a factual issue like, hey, you missed this, or hey, you didn't consider that, but you actually think we're just wrong on the law, then a formal hearing is the venue for that. And that's the hearing where, again, it's not meant to be intimidating or cost prohibitive or anything like that. It's more that if you want to come into a hearing, you come in, there's a hearing officer, you lay out your case, we lay out our case, and then there's a decision and we go from there. So again, I'm not trying to end on a negative note and talk about penalties or hearings or things like that. I just want to instead highlight that, yes, when we inspect folks, we do come across issues. Even well-intentioned, sophisticated, well-informed employers sometimes have compliance issues. Today, you guys asked a couple of questions. I'm going to go check and make sure that it's 12 years old in New Hampshire. So there's things that come up that we all understand are missed, and not for lack of trying or lack of care. So we understand that issues come up, and I just want to highlight that even when issues come up, we're always happy to work with folks and work through issues. So I'll end it there and happy to take any questions.
Hey, Rudy, it's Mike. I have a question for you.
Yep.
So received a couple of questions about this over the last few weeks, and I got another one again today. Specific to if a business is trying to get all their employees to get vaccinated, and they're having an instance where certain staff members are refusing to or uncomfortable doing so, whatever it might be, and if they were to terminate those employees, what are the ramifications if that were to happen?
So in a general sense, that type of action or decision is allowable in New Hampshire. All I would point out, and what I mean is we are an at-will state. You are able to have such requirements and say, hey, you need to have this or you can't work for me. The only thing I would point out, and I'm not doing this just because I'm a lawyer, but if the person was going to make some type of argument that you were doing it for, discriminatory purposes, do they have, a protected condition? So if someone was to say, I can't get the vaccine because of my health condition or because of perhaps a religious or some other type of protected type of status, you would just have to go. I would then encourage you, not trying to make you guys rack up legal bills, but then I would encourage you to probably talk to counsel, talk to someone, because in a general sense, you can do those types of employment actions. You could terminate someone for not meeting what requirements you have for employment. But I would just say that if someone's going to raise one of those arguments, you'd want to make sure that you're on good footing. So if someone says, well, I would get it, but I have this medical condition, then you're going to have to go through that analysis of whether, it's actually a protected condition, whether they actually could seek some type of reasonable accommodation or exception or thing of that nature.
And is it also fair to say that it would be advisable to have their policy requiring the vaccination, whatever the situation is, but it should be an written policy rather than a knee-jerk reaction because somebody tested positive or something silly like that?
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think that anytime you have something like that defined and documented up front, at a minimum, it's going to take away that argument that you're acting in an arbitrary or capricious manner, or that you're in any way unevenly applying things. So Mike brings up a really good point. I actually, to that point, I know people don't always like handbooks and things of that nature. Documentation is really helpful for instances such as that, because if you have something documented, like Mike's saying, it's not coming across as knee-jerk, it's not coming across as reactionary, it's not coming across as emotional. You have this defense of saying, here you go, this is our defined policy, it's documented, and this is what the expectation is. So that's a really good point, Mike.
So Amy, do we have any other questions?
It does not look like we have any other questions at this time. Last call, any questions out there? Looks like crickets.
Well, before we go, if I could just put in a plug and just thank Rudy for all of his hard work over the last at least 18 months, but frankly, it's been for all the time I've worked with Rudy over the years. So appreciate all of his hard work and support and his willingness to be available for questions pretty much 24/7, because I ask him questions on the weekend and he gets right back to me. So I really can't thank him enough for all of that. So Rudy, thank you, and thank you for doing this today.
I appreciate it, Mike. And like I always say to Mike, if I don't know the answer, and even some things that came up today, I'm going to confirm, but like we will find the answer. And for us, it's not about being right, pounding our chests and penalizing people. We just want to follow the law. And we understand the practical implications of that. So we try and be, work with folks to get there. So thank you guys so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Rudy. Thanks everyone for joining. This is recorded and will be shared for future viewing. Thank you. Have a good day.